Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Colin Jones, President-elect of City Club. For more than 100 years, the City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel and are joined by thousands of Oregonians via X-Ray FM's radio station, KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app, and Open Signal's community media television stations. The generous support of City Club's media partnerships and corporate sponsors enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to recognize City Club's winter sponsor, Portland General Election, for their generous support. Please show our appreciation to everyone who has made today's event possible with a round of applause. Today, we're going to spend some time looking ahead to the legislative session that kicks off in Salem in a couple of weeks. Governor Kate Brown has laid out her priorities, including job creation, gun control, and solutions to opioid addiction. And there is momentum for the Clean Energy Jobs Bill, an attempt at lowering carbon emissions while also giving the clean energy sector a boost. However, looming over all of these issues is Measure 101. The votes will be tallied next week, and many people will be nervously watching the results come in. If Measure 101 fails, the legislature will likely turn its full attention to funding the Oregon Health Plan, leaving little room for other priorities. Here to help us untangle these and other issues are Dick Hughes, freelance journalist and former editorial page editor at the Statesman Journal, and Hillary Broward, Oregon politics and state government reporter at the Oregonian. They'll talk with John Horvick, vice president and political director at DHM Research, about what's reasonable to expect during this short session, what issues are likely to be put off until 2019, and whether the short session approach is living up to its promise. Please join me in welcoming them all.
Well, good afternoon to our panelists and to City Club. It's a pleasure to be back here and be able to talk about these important issues to the state. We're going to go ahead and just dive right in. There's a lot to cover, and we want to take advantage of our expertise here. But I want to just do some stage setting first and ground ourselves in just what the heck is the short session. So Oregon hasn't always had this session. It was initiated with a constitutional amendment passed by voters in 2010. The first session was in 2011. Could you, Dick, we'll start with you, just walk us through a little bit. What is its history and why did it emerge? How did we get to this point where we have this short session?
It starts with the fact that Oregon still claims to have a citizen legislature, that people have real jobs and real lives outside the Oregon Capitol. And so the legislature would meet in odd-numbered years, put together a 2-year budget, and be there through June or July or August. And over time, they realized that they couldn't put together a good 2-year budget knowing everything that was going to happen. And there were things that were always coming up. And so they'd had all these special sessions, which often were contentious. One year they had 5 special sessions. And so Peter Courtney, the Senate president, was the leader in pushing for annual sessions. And with the idea that they would have a guaranteed short session added to their workload, and it would be in the even-numbered years. So that started in 2012, and I think the first year it was 35 days long. It's a maximum of 35 days. The next year they adjourned, or the next time they adjourned in 34 days, and the next time it was 33, et cetera, because Courtney always wants to adjourn before the constitutional deadline. So now they have this session this year that's only 35 days. Then in the regular session in odd-numbered years is for 160 days. And the prime goal of the legislature in both sessions is to deal with the budget. That's the one thing it always has to do.
All right, so it occurs in even-numbered years, maximum 35 days, prime goal to work with the budget. Hillary, how has it actually worked in practice?
Okay, so looking back on how these things have gone, it seems like there was controversy around it from pretty early on about whether it was meeting what some people thought was or a lot of people thought was the goal. So the lawmakers had sold this to voters saying, look, this will make government more accountable because we'll be coming to you, we'll be doing our business more frequently, we'll be more efficient instead of putting things off or having these supplemental sessions. And before, there was no limit to how long a session could go, so even the longer sessions now are limited. And there was concern almost from the get-go about, is it so short that bad bills are getting through? Do we really have enough time in 35 days to vet legislation properly? And so an example from a session I covered in 2016, there was another ambitious climate change bill called Coal to Clean. It doubled the state's renewable energy mandate, and because of that, PGE and PacifiCorp are supposed to phase out buying coal electricity from other states. So big policy bill, and we also passed the minimum wage increases that year.
Dick, anything that you've experienced or seen in the short session that matches with what the original intent was or has moved beyond it?
Well, you have that tug and pull between the House and the Senate. And you have the House, which is more progressive overall than the Senate. The Senate is more centrist, and particularly the Senate President, Peter Courtney, because he cares very much about process. And he doesn't want anything that will blow up the special session. So what that means this year is, what will he do to block bills that he's afraid will blow up the session? I mean, we saw that in the 2017 legislature when the renter bill didn't make it through the Senate. Some gun control bills didn't make it through committee and things like that, because he's very wary of what happened in 2016 when the minority Republicans had little influence other than the ability not to show up.
So they sort of brought things to a halt. And something that Courtney can also do, in addition to, I should have mentioned, the short sessions are kind of self-limiting because there's only so much you can do in 35 days. For example, there are all these deadlines, Dick, so we look at those. The first week of the session, you have to have your bill scheduled for a hearing, and if not, it's dead. Courtney and then the leaders in the House can also set limits on how many bills lawmakers get to introduce. I think it's just 1 for the Senate and 2 for the House this time.
Yeah, the Senate could have gone with 2, but again, Courtney self-limited. The interesting thing, too, is we look at these big issues, the budget, health care financing if Measure 101 fails, the clean energy jobs bills. Each of those pieces only involves a few legislators, the legislators on the key committee. There are 90 legislators, so they have to find something else to do. So that could be good, or it could be mischief.
Just a little bit more stage setting. When does the session start? And what's the makeup of the Oregon legislature right now, breakdown between Democrats and Republicans?
The session starts February 5th, 8:30 a.m., Monday morning. At 9:30, there's a joint session with Governor Kate Brown breaking tradition, or I would hope starting a new tradition, of having the governor deliver her or his State of the State address to the legislature. Previously, that's been done at the Portland City Club in even-numbered years or other places. But I think it's good to have the legislators there and here. And the makeup is the Democrats control both houses, but they need Republican votes for any tax bills to pass.
Well, let's move on. The big thing that is Oregonians are going to be voting on in next Tuesday is Measure 101. So it's a special election, as many people probably know. Hopefully all of you in this room are going to vote or have voted already. It is a temporary fee on healthcare services, health insurance, health providers to help fund the Oregon Health Plan. It's a referendum, so voters are asked to weigh in on something the legislature passed last year. And it is placed on the ballot in January in part to have the decision made before the session starts, so the legislature knows what sort of dollars they're working with and what sort of policies they need to address. So let's play both sides of this a bit. Hillary, let's assume for a minute that Measure 101 fails. What are you hearing about the revenue and healthcare impact should voters reject Measure 101?
Well, that's interesting because I've been trying to get a sense of, and you'll hear this a lot from the Yes campaign for Measure 101. They're saying that there's no backup plan, and they're referring to well, I shouldn't say proponents. It gets confusing with referendums. They are referring to no backup plan on the part of the people that want to overturn this tax, or the no side, basically. And they actually do have a bill that they are introducing, they just recently released, that would, I think, look to cigarette taxes to make up some of the money. They want to basically tweak how the state taxes hospitals. It hasn't been publicly vetted, so there are a lot of questions around that. But I was curious, too, people that support these taxes, do they have a backup plan? And have been having a hard time hearing about that or getting details.
Well, they're publicly saying they don't have a backup plan, and they're privately saying they don't have a backup plan. But they have to be thinking about that. And the reality is, the legislature is not going to kick 300,000 Oregonians off the Oregon Health Plan. That is not going to happen, no matter what. They might tweak some of the health benefits. They might do some cuts in other programs, and they might affect your taxes by disconnecting some of Oregon's tax rules from the federal tax rules, from the new federal tax law, which could produce several $100 million. Because if the health plan fails, that's a couple, or if Measure 101 fails, that's a couple $100 million the legislature either has to not spend on health care, or take from other areas, or increase taxes and fees.
So if it fails, does that mean that all the energy is sucked up in the legislature dealing with the consequence of that failure? A small bit, and other things are going to be addressed as well, some big policies. What does the dynamic look like in the legislature in a world where 101 fails?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I think what I would like to know is how prepared people are on this, and I'm sure that they have been discussing it. Obviously, there are those conversations about how do we respond to the Republican tax plan that passed at the federal level, because that could be, I mean, right now it's looking like that could cost the state actually $100 million or more in revenue in the current biennium, so that would even widen the budget hole. So that's where you get those conversations about something that they could do. There's a tax break for pass-through businesses in Oregon, but the Republicans' tax plan helped those businesses as well. So do we get rid of the Oregon tax benefit there and raise some money?
Again, going back to the makeup of the legislature, remember that very few legislators will actually be involved in any negotiations on what to do if Measure 101 fails. But yes, it will hang over the entire legislature, and people will walk around glumly. But other people will be doing other things. And the even bigger issue, as Hillary points out, is what the legislature does with the federal tax plan, because the federal tax plan, in case you haven't noticed, is a bit complicated. And one of the swings is, will overseas corporations bring back the $1.3 trillion that they've parked overseas? Bringing it back is called repatriation. I don't understand why it's called that. But that could cost Oregon an additional $100 million. Or Oregon could gain $100 million or so from it. And so it could be a swing from the state losing $200 million, or depending what the legislature does, in a very short session where they have to come up with tax policy that has support from both Republicans and Democrats. They could create policy that gains the state $500 or so million.
For our broadcast audience, this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm John Horvick, and I'm speaking with Dick Hughes, a freelance journalist and former editorial page editor for the Statesman Journal, and Hillary Borud, Oregon politics and state government reporter at the Oregonian. All right, let's imagine 101 passes. What then?
Well, it would certainly free up some air in the legislature to go after those big policy bills that a lot of Democrats want to pursue. Cap and invest, they're calling it, would certainly be the big one. And so that bill would be basically putting a statewide cap on greenhouse gas emissions for some of the largest polluters in Oregon that are not in the agriculture industry. And then it would charge them for their pollution over that. It's supposed to raise as much as $1.4 billion per biennium, so every 2 years. It's a lot of money. Dick, what else would you add to that in terms of priorities?
Well, that's certainly a priority for the Democrats, particularly in the House. The interesting thing on that, while we're on that, is Governor Brown supports it, but she has not been making a big push about it. And I tried to talk to the Senate president about it, and he expertly dodged the question. So the issue is going to be, will there be support for it in the Senate? It probably will pass the House. Will there be support for it in the Senate? And if there is, it will be some sort of deal, probably. For example, Republicans might want to loosen land use restrictions in Eastern Oregon or something like that. So there'll be a variety of other things going on, because there is, on the one hand, you could consider it vote trading. On the other hand, it's a way the legislators try to find a compromise. And if you look at the 2017 session, the House passed a lot of very progressive bills. The Senate massaged them into bills that were a bit more centrist, but they came out with bipartisan support, such as pay equity and other issues. And is that something that can happen with a clean energy jobs bill?
Well, and I think from a political perspective on this bill, something that is important to note is just how wide-ranging it is, how many industries it would affect in Oregon. So in terms of getting something passed in only 35 days, this could affect food processors, paper mills, cement plants, also gas companies, the biggest utilities in the state. They are all opposing it. And there are lawmakers with those kinds of businesses, like manufacturers in their districts, that would be regulated under this. So that is going to make it, you know, they're talking about sending some of the money back to districts through incentivizing different environmental kind of job creation enterprises. So that's the political push and pull there.
So let's just talk about this a little bit more. Who are the key players with it's called Cap and Invest or Cap and Trade or the Clean Energy Jobs Bill? So who are the key players? Why is this coming up now in 2018? How does it fit with sort of, as we set the stage about what the purpose of the short session is? Why now? And who are the players?
Well, so one of the big players in this is a 501c4 group called Renew Oregon. They're pretty tied in with Oregon's environmental community, and they have been behind a couple other big climate change targeting bills in recent years. So the low carbon fuels mandate that passed in 15 or became permanent in 15, the coal to clean bill that I mentioned earlier, which is doubling the state's renewable energy mandate and phasing out buying coal power from other states, that passed in the previous short session in 2016. And so they've said this is their third big policy priority to get passed this year. And you also have bigger PERS problems and budget problems hanging over the legislature in 2019. So then this is, even though we have Measure 101 and that big budget question, it might be even tougher financially next year.
This is being cast as a bicameral bill. In other words, it has support in both the House and the Senate. But no one that I know of is claiming that it is bipartisan within the legislature. And the two committee chairs who are heading up this drive are Democrats Ken Helm of the Beaverton area. And I just,
Senator
And
Dembro?
Senator
yeah,
Dembro,
Senator
Portland.
Michael Dembro of the Portland area. And they've been working on this for quite a while, and there have been work groups, and this was an issue that came up in the 2017 legislature. And
Multiple years, yeah.
yeah, Senate President Courtney sent a message to Republicans that it wasn't going, that some of these environmental bills were not going to advance, so they didn't have to worry, by sending at least one bill to a dead committee where it couldn't come out. But that was a way of letting Republicans know they didn't have to worry about that. That's one reason the Reproductive Health Equity Act passed in the legislature, because the Republicans voted against it and protested it for the most part. But on the other hand, Courtney had met one of their objectives by sidelining this other bill.
So one of the things I've been curious about with this short session, and maybe this is true with Cap and Invest, and maybe it's not, but nothing happens in a vacuum. Politics don't stop when the session ends. We're going to roll right into a primary season and a general election season. To what degree or respect does the threat of ballot measures go out and collecting signatures on policies, particularly big policies that are maybe some might say too big of a bite for the short session, but to hold out leverage for negotiations? How, if you sort of put Cap and Invest or maybe expand it to other issues, where does the ballot measure sort of impacts, the threats of going out to collect signatures impact negotiations for something like a Cap and Invest?
Well, it certainly can affect. That was one reason the Democrats were able to push through the minimum wage 2 years ago. The question is, and you probably would know this better than I, John, but is there much interest statewide in an arcane subject like cap and trade? I mean, it has to, for a ballot measure, it has to be something that's really, I think, compelling to the public. You can get anything on the ballot by hiring signature gatherers. But the question is, will they pass it? So I'm curious what you think.
So what we see, wear my professional hat for a moment, the political director at THM Research, frequently do surveys and focus groups around the state around policy matters. And if we ask Oregonians what are the most important issues that they want to see addressed, right, it's not climate change, it's pretty far down the list. If we ask Oregonians how concerned are they about climate change, moderate level of concern and growing. If you just look at Democrats, the concern is quite high, and certainly it's intense among advocacy organizations. So you can see where those dynamics, even if it's a lower level issue, it's certainly being pushed hard by key constituencies. If you ask Oregonians, do you support sort of a policy to reduce carbon emissions? No trouble getting to yes on that. But if you get into particular around, well, are you willing to pay more for your electricity rates, for example? Well, then support falls fairly quickly. Now, it's not to the numbers that suggest that absolutely something couldn't pass at the ballot, but certainly it would be a challenge. But the Oregonians, it's not their top issue. Other things are, but it is important to key groups. And we see increasing in support or concern around climate and climate issues here in the state. Let's move on to Governor Brown. So in our introductory, Colin shared with us some of the key priorities for the governor, and we can talk about those priorities a bit as well. But I just want to talk, what is her sort of role in the short session? Is she going to be looking to bring people together and negotiate? Is she expecting people to block Mark step in her agenda? Is she taking a step back? Hillary, how is Governor Brown going to interact with the legislature this short session?
So I think that's really interesting, and as Dick had mentioned, she's officially in support of the carbon cap and pricing plan, but she doesn't seem to be so far putting a lot of her political power behind it. And I would actually say that her agenda for the session that she came out with last week I think that tracks more the short session type of agenda, even though probably some people would disagree because she is targeting gun control. She wants to close the so-called boyfriend loophole for people that have domestic violence or stalking convictions to be able to purchase guns. But she's going after just a very anticipated public pensions PERS shortfall bill that she's got. It's supposed to raise a little bit of money by trying to get local governments to match state funds to buy that down a little bit. She's got the gun bill. She's got something that's trying to help with affordable housing by lightening regulations on some contractors or giving them grants and low interest loans. Dick, what do you think?
Well, I think she's going to get a lot of criticism for having such a modest agenda, but it should be recognized this is a short session, and it makes sense to have a modest agenda. And even with these things, some of them cost money. And with the state revenue and economic forecast will come out February 16th, and that's the big date that everybody's looking for, as well as January 23rd, the results of Measure 101. The state revenue forecast is expected to be up a little bit, depending upon what they finally decide about the federal tax reforms. But everything the governor and a lot of other people are asking for involves money, and there's not that much money to go around. Hillary, you mentioned the gun control bill. It's interesting. These various, quote, loopholes have names. The boyfriend loophole would extend who could be prohibited from having a gun because of domestic violence or similar misdemeanor. You can't have a gun if you're a felon. They are not going after the so-called Charleston loophole because that would not pass the Oregon Senate. That was one of the bills that Senator Peter Courtney would not let go forward in the past session. So again, this is an example of how negotiations are being held even before the legislature starts.
So let's do a little role playing here. Dick, imagine you were Governor Brown's political advisor. She's heading into a campaign year. What would a successful short session look like for candidate Kate Brown?
Things that she can say she led. Now, that may include a running to the head of the parade, as Governor Tom McCall was very good at, and other leaders in Oregon history. So this is not a new thing. McCall gets credit for environmental things that Bob Straub and others started. But I think it would be no huge disruptions, things that she could say, yes, we tackled this with the opioid crisis. Yes, we got eased regulations in rural Oregon for home building, things like that. Yes, we dealt with PERS, and we have more things coming. And also a session that would not have accomplishments for Newt Buehler, Republican legislator from Bend, who is right now the primary Republican candidate. One of the interesting and good, or probably bad things about this session, this is going to be the first session when the filing deadline for the November election falls during the session, right before the end of the session. So there's going to be so much politicking going on with Republicans and Democrats trying to make each other look bad.
Again, for our broadcast audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm John Horvick, and I'm speaking with Dick Hughes, a freelance journalist and former editorial page editor at the Statesman Journal, and Hillary Borud, Oregon politics and state government reporter at the Oregonian. Well, Hillary, if you were her campaign advisor, what would make you nervous about this short session?
Well, I think that Governor Brown will probably come out of this session looking the best if Measure 101 passes, because then there won't be a lot of headlines about how lawmakers and the governor are struggling to close this big budget gap or heaven forbid, for them, talking about what health benefits they're going to have to cut for people that are on Medicaid or how many people are going to lose Medicaid. So I would definitely want Measure 101 to pass if I were her. It's interesting because she's gone into the session with this modest agenda, and at the same time, she has been really playing up her national level appearances on, say, CNN, talking about these federal issues and going after Trump. And of course, a lot of us has probably heard about how she's the most anti-Trump governor in the nation. So she's choosing to identify herself more with those issues. And John, I'd be interested in what you've been able to learn about Oregonians' familiarity or support for her, and if any of those things seem to appeal to them.
So Governor Brown has, in terms of favorability or job performance, has always had sort of moderate levels of support. She basically gets Democrats, she sort of splits independents, and Republicans are against her, sort of a kind of ho-hum sort of reaction from the Oregon electorate right now. Now, that probably is good enough as a starting point if she were running it against a generic candidate. Oregonians, I have very little knowledge of any individual representative, their own, let alone someone from some other place of the state. So Newt Bueller's name ID isn't great, but neither is any Republican really in the state right now. My sense is that that doesn't make much difference so long as the Republican candidate is an especially polarizing figure, that Republicans would tend to rally around their candidate, whether it's Representative Bueller or somebody else. There is some interesting things. Representative Bueller has been more moderate on some social issues and whether or not Republicans might try to find a hard-line candidate or a Trump-focused candidate. I'm not really seeing that out there right now. Maybe you are. But typically, if you look back at the last several gubernatorial elections, the Democrat has won with somewhere between 49 and 51% of the vote. The Republican gets about 43, 45% of the vote. I think that's a pretty reasonable starting place to assume, and then look for things that would help support Governor Brown going forward or help support the Republican candidate going forward that would change that dynamic.
One of the things that interests me is that a lot of the newspaper editorial boards really believe in a two-party state as opposed to dominant Democratic rule. And that's one reason Dennis Richardson won election as Secretary of State, because every newspaper that endorsed him. And also it's because of who he was running against. So the question also will become, will some newspapers and some other civic leaders go for Newt Bueller, if he's a Republican candidate, as a means of promoting returning more to a two-party system rather than constantly having a Democrat as governor?
Well, let's turn to the Republicans quickly. What is their agenda for the short session?
So Newt Bueller has two bills going into the session that if I had to put money on it will not get out of committee. One deals with requiring the Oregon Health Authority to repay some money that it overpaid. Without going into the details, it was initially described as much as $74 million and might be getting closer to $50 million as they actually figure out all of their accounting over there. So he would require that to be repaid, so maybe he's trying to score some political points there. I don't think that's going to go anywhere. His other bill has to do with increasing accountability and doing some reforms to the organizations that administer Medicaid in Oregon. Again, trying to go after some things that have been in the news a lot, and of course he's a doctor, so that would sort of be his area. But Newt Bueller, if he was gaining some recognition early after he was elected, because he was the driving force behind a bill to make it easier for women to get birth control, for example. So that's some of the progressive social background that he's coming from. You didn't hear headlines about a bill that he got passed like that last year. And so Democrats control the legislature. Newt Bueller hasn't been able to get any big priorities passed recently, and so that kind of benefits the Democrat in that race.
it's very difficult for the Republicans to have a large agenda that can get passed. Because for them to get anything passed, being in the minority, they have to get some Democratic votes. So I think you'll see some more regional things like land use planning in eastern Oregon, a bill regarding the Tumalo irrigation district in the Deschutes Basin, which is very important to irrigators. And Senator Dembro, a Democrat, has assured Senator Tim Knope, a Republican from Bend, that they will work on a compromise on that bill. And so you have to look for a lot of smaller things like that and try to shape some of the shape some of the Democratic bills. There also will be a whole lot of floor speeches saying this is great or this is awful. And I've only heard of a couple of times in the last 10 or 20 years where a floor speech has actually changed anyone's mind.
So the Republicans have some new leadership, though. Senator Jackie Winters will be now the Senate Minority Leader. Can you share with us a bit about who she is, what her leadership might be like, and how that may change the dynamics in the Senate and perhaps with relationships with the House?
Well, first, I should point out that Jackie Winters is my state senator. Peter Courtney at one time was my representative because I live in Salem. The interesting thing that may make Oregon unique is the relationship between moderate Democrat Senate President Peter Courtney and conservative to moderate Republican leader Jackie Winters. They're like brother and sister, the way they act. They are political siblings. They will fight, but they have each other's back. And they've worked on a whole lot of bills together. Jackie has just been a leader on human services, on law enforcement, on budget bills. And she is the first African American, or actually multiracial, and I think the first woman to lead the Oregon Senate Republicans. Peter Courtney is, a Democrat, Irish Catholic, and they're very much like siblings. Neither one would want to do anything to personally hurt the other.
So what we're going to actually see is it would be pretty unlikely in this session to see Senate Republicans doing what they did 2 years ago under Ted Ferrioli, he certainly had his own style and happens to be really close from what I've heard with Kate Brown. So, some bipartisan friendships there too, but they refuse to make a quorum and really slow things down.
It's very interesting about those bipartisan friendships because a couple of years ago, Governor Brown hosted a birthday lunch for a former Republican Senate President Gene Derfler because they were very good friends from being in the Senate together. And I think that's the advantage that the Senate has over the House because people serve 4-year terms, they're generally more experienced. You have much better working relationships for the most part than you have in the House where you have a number of newer members from both parties.
Let's move on. Since the end of the 2017 session, there have been dozens of powerful men who have been outed as sexual harassers and assaulters. And this has affected the Oregon legislature too. Senator Sarah Glazer has accused Senator Jeff Cruz of harassment. Senator Cruz has since been stripped of all committee assignments and even been stripped of his door to his office. Hillary, can you talk about the fallout and the dynamics of this? What is the mood among the legislators, their staff, their lobbyists, since these accusations and developments over the last several months?
Yeah, I think it's going to be, I think that a lot of the changes in the mood probably will be happening not in a way that we would observe, even though allegedly Senator Cruz had committed some of these transgressions against Senator Gelser while she was out on the floor of the Senate, a lot of this is going to be some of the closed door or the lobbyist with the lawmaker, or lobbyist with lobbyist kind of events, I think, where you really might see some different people handling themselves differently, I guess you would hope, now that they know kind of what the stakes are, and it's really a conversation about what's appropriate. Because when we were talking to people about this, there's a lot of stuff that was not on the record, there's a lot of stuff that wasn't reported, and I think that at the very least, some of those people who might have acted inappropriately in the past have been put on notice that they could get in trouble for it.
It's already affected, I think, the dynamics in that I would guess that's one reason that Jackie Winters was elected by the Republicans to be the Senate leader, because it makes it more difficult for Democrats to go after Republicans on the sexual harassment issue when the Republicans are now led by a woman. Plus, you had a split among the Republicans. Some of the older Republicans thought, well, that's just the way Jeff Cruz is. Good old boy, just get over it. Got to learn to tolerate him. And then there are others like Senator Tim Knopa Bent, who's absolutely opposed and concerned about the sexual harassment. And he was not elected as the Senate Republican leader, even though he's the longtime deputy leader, so it would have been logical that he be elected.
Let me put on my professional hat for a moment. So I'm the political director at DHM Research. We do hundreds of surveys a year and focus groups across the state, regularly asking Oregonians, what are the most important issues that you want your local or your state elected officials to do something about? If I go back 2, 3, 5 years ago, it was jobs in the economy was number one overwhelmingly. K-12 education was right up there as well. Taxes are probably the big 3 issues that people would mention. Now, the 2 biggest issues by far are homelessness and affordable housing. Congestion, traffic issues are also coming up the list, as well as concerns. In this short session, if we look at what voters tell us are the most important issues to them: housing, homelessness, traffic, congestion, roads, are those issues on the agenda for the short session? And if, I see Dick is shaking his head no, and if not, why not?
I think it's because those are the most difficult things to solve, and I think that we've seen government struggling to make a difference on those at all levels in Oregon, from the city of Portland trying to figure out its affordable housing, how to get it built fast enough, how to make sure that promises are followed through on, all kinds of issues. And then at the state level, they also don't seem to have hit on the magic formula to fix that. We do have the transportation bill that hopefully would help with congestion. Dick, what do you think?
There will be some tweaks to the transportation bill, probably. I don't think anything major, but legislators always find something they should have done better in a previous session. So you can look for them to tweak around the edges. Governor Brown is promoting her legislation to help people become contractors and develop their own small contracting businesses in rural Oregon as a way to expand affordable housing. I don't know whether that will happen or not, but that's such a huge issue. And Oregon has a lot of plans. I don't know how many people know that Oregon for a long time has had a 10-year homelessness plan, how to deal with homelessness. And I don't know that we've seen statewide a lot of improvement. It's an issue in every community. And Governor Brown, when she spoke at Churchill High School in Eugene this week, was asked by a student who'd been homeless for several years, what is she going to do about homelessness?
Let's now go to audience for some questions. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for staff to collect. You can also submit questions through Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. I'll try to read at least one index card question and one from Twitter. We invite City Club members to ask their questions at the microphone. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Please identify yourself as a club member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less. Mr. Zarin.
Jim Zarin, City Club member, excuse me. It shows how much I know. I don't think I've heard the acronym PERS. And state government, local government, school districts, it's the colossus that everybody's struggling with. I guess it's kind of the same question, John, you asked. People are interested in solving certain problems, and it sounds like the legislature doesn't have any plans to deal with them. What's the scoop on PERS?
I can take that quickly. So Governor Brown does have a PERS proposal for this session. I would say it's probably her biggest or meatiest bill. And it comes from, she had a task force over the last year looking into ideas to, she was just trying to get $5 billion in money to pay down that big old $25 billion shortfall. So she wants to take just $5 billion out of it, which shows you how tough it is. And her idea that she's going to go forward with in the legislature is to come up with a state matching fund that would put in about 25 cents on the dollar, trying to get your local city or school district or whatever to pony up some of their money. So it's, I don't know how much that's going to actually help because it just depends on two governments in any particular arrangement coming up with that money.
Just one quick addition. Senator Bill Hansel, Republican from Athena near Pendleton in Eastern Oregon, when this bill was being talked about, thanked the governor's staff for finally taking the PERS issue seriously and saying it was an immediate problem.
Just from a public opinion perspective, I mean, obviously editorial pages write about PERS a lot, and those managing budgets at the local and state level worry about PERS costs a lot. But when we ask Oregonians, important issues, PERS rarely gets mentioned. I think in part because there's not yet a direct connection in the voters' minds between PERS costs and that pothole in front of their street. And until there is, and until that they're able to articulate that that's a problem to their legislators, it's hard for me to see it becoming the burning issue in a session.
And it's interesting because Kate Brown will be seeking election this year. She is seeking election now for what would be her last term, at least consecutively. She can't run for another term. And so there's not too much of it. She has this proposal, but by the time PERS is even more of an issue in 2019, she will have been elected or not.
Let's go to our next question.
John Calhoun, City Club member. You mentioned housing, that nothing was going to go on, but there will be an effort to increase the transfer fee, real estate transfer fee, to provide funds for housing. What are your thoughts on the prospects of that?
It depends upon the overall negotiations. A lot of things will wait till the end, and it depends upon who's lining up on which side. And if somebody's proposing it who looks vulnerable by the other party, they'll fight it. And if it looks like something that people can approve without being labeled on the Republican side as having hiked taxes, even though it's a fee, it does have a chance. But again, everything relates to everything else in a small session. We're dealing with a giant jigsaw puzzle. We don't know what the final picture is supposed to look like, and we don't know how the pieces are cut, but yet the legislature has to start putting them together.
Next question.
Greg McPherson, City Club member. This is a question for Dick Hughes. You mentioned a couple of times the proposal from last session of the legislature to alter Eastern Oregon land use planning, which, just to explain to the listening audience, in its last iteration would functionally repeal statewide land use planning for 35% of the state of Oregon. That was sponsored by Senator Ferrioli, who's no longer in the Senate. So why does it continue to have traction?
I think it has traction, but would never come out the way Senator Ferrioli had proposed it. Peter Courtney supported Ferrioli as a Republican leader then, bringing it forward in hopes that Peter Courtney looked for ways to please the Republicans and work with them. In this case, Courtney may be working with Senator Bill Hansel, and I think that, as I understand it, it wouldn't go as far, but it might loosen some requirements. And again, that's going to be a heavy lift for Democratic legislators, and it will need Democratic legislators' support to pass. And there were some changes in the 2017 session on mining, on the Eastern Oregon Economic Development District, and things like that, where House Speaker Tina Kotek and others could find common ground with the Republicans. So I would look for something that's a more manageable compromise. The Portland Democrats could defend to their constituents, as well as Eastern Oregonians could praise to their constituents.
Next question.
Hi, Colin Jones again. I am wondering, as I hear all of these priorities that we need to get to, it's sort of making me wonder if the short legislative session is sort of this holdover from when we were a smaller state with less going on. And so I think my question is, do you think there's an appetite, either in the electorate or in the legislature, to move to a full session? And if not, what would it take to build that appetite?
I hope not. One historical thing quickly. Again, we do claim to have citizen legislators. And the longer that you have sessions, the less or the more difficult it is for somebody to have another job and come be in the legislature. When every year sessions were proposed, starting in the Senate voted to have 40-day sessions in even-numbered years. The House reduced that to 35 days in order to have 160-day sessions in odd-numbered years. So I would see more something like that happening, that they would shorten the long session and lengthen the short session.
In our polling, when we ask people job approval of the Oregon legislature, you typically get somewhere between 40-45%, which doesn't sound like a particularly good number. But if you compare it to, say, the U.S. Congress, where it looks single digits, people are relatively satisfied, all things considered, with the way that the legislature in Oregon has performed. Unless Oregonians see some sort of crisis and can pin it to how the legislature is organized, I wouldn't expect to see changes to the lengths of our sessions anytime soon.
Hi, it's Bobby Regan, City Club member. If you look at state government, it typically funds three big buckets: public safety, public education, and human services, which certainly includes healthcare. So if Measure 101 fails and we suddenly lose $300 million of funding in that area, if the legislature chooses to keep all of these folks on health care, which I hope they do, can you give me any assurance that the hit won't be most severe to public education?
I really couldn't tell you where they would take the money from, but there are a lot of, just for example, they started out last session with close to $1 billion shortfall in the Medicaid budget, or over at the Oregon Health Authority, and they solved part of it by raiding various funds that they had, like some kind of hospital excellence fund or something, and they said, well, we'll take this money over here and help plug the hole with that. And then they raised taxes that haven't even been included in Measure 101, so those are still there. So the point is, I don't know all of the places that they could get really creative with to find some money, but that's still enough that you'd probably have a hit. And it could be as little as $200 million, just because there's some legal dispute over whether it would delay versus completely repeal one of the taxes. But yeah, it could come from anywhere.
Let's take a question from one of our index cards. So the specific question is, how will Oregon's sanctuary cities react to the federal government's demands? So we could take it at the city level, but Oregon is a sanctuary state as well. Are you hearing much about how legislators might be thinking about its sanctuary status, immigration policy? Will that be part of the conversation at all in the short session?
I don't expect it to be a conversation in the short session, no. The governor and the Democratic leaders have been adamant in supporting the current state policy, but there's a proposed ballot measure that's being worked on that may come before voters in the fall that would repeal Oregon's sanctuary status.
Steve Shell, member. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was an emergency board that functioned in between legislators. With the change to annual legislators, I noticed that increasingly the legislature is providing for enduring joint committees. And I'm wondering how you see that affecting the legislation that comes before the Oregon legislature.
I actually think it's a really good idea. And it's one way that Oregon is much better than Congress. There still is an emergency board. It doesn't do that much. It's not needed as much. But when you have a joint committee like put together the transportation bill, you got all the players in the room often for very heated discussions behind closed doors. And you got things worked out. And now there's a joint committee to deal with student success. And in large part, it's because Senate President Peter Courtney is fed up with the fact that Oregon has never been able to solve its education funding problem and its educational excellence problem. So if you have really good legislators, talented legislators who can work together, Republicans, Democrats, House, and Senate, you are more likely to get things done. And that's how, for example, there's a Joint Ways and Means Committee. And there was a joint marijuana committee, which got a lot of jokes, the joint marijuana committee. And, you know, the U.S. attorney in Oregon may not feel that the regulations are strong enough, but Oregon collaboratively between Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, did a lot as far as regulating marijuana.
One more question from the microphone.
My name's Kathy Moyd. I'm a City Club member, and I'm also a volunteer AARP tax aide. And so I'm certainly just getting through my training session and realizing how complicated, well, I already knew how complicated the whole tax system is, and I'm just about to learn how complicated the Oregon one is compared to the federal one. And I'm just wondering, it doesn't seem like there's going to be enough time in this short session to deal with all the differences that are in the tax bill that could affect Oregon. So is there going to be one of these committees you just talked about that's going to actually work on this and then have a special session to adopt something before the taxes have to be done next year?
I have not heard about that happening yet, but I think they have some pretty good analysis of at least what they'd need to do immediately.
Both the House and Senate Revenue Committee chairs are working on ideas. Senator Mark Hass, Democrat from Beaverton area, and Representative Phil Barnhart, Democrat from Eugene. So they've been working on things, and part of it is they're still just trying to get the analysis done. And they're looking at what other states are doing. And as Representative Barnhart mentioned a few days ago, on the same day he got articles saying that the federal tax bill was going to be horrible for states and the federal tax bill was going to be great for states. So who knows at this point?
I think that it's also a political issue too, because even when they understand things, there's going to be disagreement between Republicans and Democrats on, you know, if Oregonians are getting a tax break, but we're going to be losing revenue, you know, in the state government, should we try and close that loop, you know, close that up a little bit or not?
We are out of broadcast time and will have to stop for the day. If this program has inspired you to join or contribute to City Club, you can do so at the registration table as you leave the room. Thank you so much to our panel. This is Colin Jones from City Club's Board of Governors. Special thanks to Bobby Reagan and the Friday Forum Committee for their hard work. This program is adjourned.